Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cipher Brief. I am Iya Meur-Mishuli. I'm Chief International Correspondent here at the Cipher Brief. This may be the first time you're seeing me, but hopefully you'll be seeing more of me later on. We do have some pretty exciting announcements coming up, so check us out on our website, write to us, stay in touch, and we'll send you updates about our plans and what we're doing. So again, my name is Iya Meur-Mishuli. I am Chief International Correspondent here at the Cipher Brief. And today we'll be talking, the webinar is about Iranian presidential elections, succession, everything related to anything that you can imagine that is a topic of importance as we look at Iran. The elections in Iran will be held on the 28th in 4 days. And there are some interesting developments that our guests today will share their insights and thoughts on. During the session, you can send questions to, you can see the email address on your screen now. You can send the questions to thecipherbrief.com. And you can also use the session itself to type up your questions, and we'll be sure to pose them if we have time. And now I would like to introduce our guests. I'm very excited to say that Paula Doyle will be joining us. Paula is former Associate Deputy Director of Operations at CIA. In her time, and Paula can come on the video if you would like. In her time at CIA, she led 3 CIA stations in Europe, in Levant, in Asia. Paula has also served as the Deputy National Counterintelligence Executive, as a Foreign Service Officer in Latin America and Europe. She's currently teaching at Georgetown University at the Center for Security Studies. And our second guest is Glenn Korn. He's a former senior executive at the CIA who worked for 34 years in the U.S. intelligence, defense, and foreign affairs communities. He spent over 17 years serving overseas and served as the U.S. President's senior representative intelligence and security issues. He's also an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics. So Paula, Glenn, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all the participants for being with us online right now. And let's get started. Paula, let's start from you, if you would. Just overall Iranian elections. Let's just open up the conversation. What do these elections mean? Are they elections? Are they free and fair? What's the participation like? So very in the broad strokes, what can you say about them?
So I would say that the upcoming presidential elections are likely to be anticlimactic. All of the candidates have been pre-approved by the Guardian Council and the Supreme Leader. And what that means is that because of the way the system works there, all of those running for office already have sworn on basically an oath to support the Supreme Leader's architecture, whether it's foreign, domestic, environmental, cultural, religious policies. And those policies, of course, are seen through the lens of the interpretation of Sharia law. So there's not a lot of room for maneuver with any of the presidential candidates. And it's really important, I think, for our listeners, some of whom are exceptionally well-versed on Iran and others may be new. The Velayat-e Faqih system is not going to permit a president to run unless he's on the page. The notion that there are moderates is, in my view, indefensible. I see that term a lot in the press. Glenn and I have talked about this over the years, and I look forward to his views, but my own are, don't expect any moderate voices to emerge. Certainly not from former IRGC commander in Tehran, Mayor Kalibaf. Certainly not from the former chief negotiator on nuclear matters, Saeed Jalili. Certainly not from the former counterintelligence director, and certainly not from Raisi's chief vice president, Hashemi. And I wouldn't look for anything out of left field from the current mayor of Tehran, Zaghani. Just one comment about Masoud Pezeshkian, who has been labeled a reformist. He has certainly worked hard to relabel himself that, with some help of several supporters in the Majlis. He has still sworn the same oath to the Supreme Leader. He comes from the same cloth. He is the only ethnic Azeri in the candidate pool. I view his selection by the guardians in the Supreme Leader as more of a bid to try to get turnout from the Azeri area of Iran, rather than a nod towards his so-called self-professed reformist views.
And Glenn, as we know, there were 80 candidates or 80 potential candidates before the 6 that Paula spoke of were selected. Can we call this elections? And coming from the U.S., I'm sure for some of our audiences, this question would sound kind of off the top. But can we call this elections free and fair in any way?
In my opinion, no. It's very hard to call them free and fair elections. I don't think that the people of Iran are going to have a say in who is going to be the next president. I think a very small minority, very, very small minority of Iranians will have that decision, and it's actually the Supreme Leader who has the decision. So,
and what's the process like? So, candidates, and by the way, they had a 4-hour-long debate, televised debate about economy, security, mainly about economy still. So what's the process like? It seems like they have there is some process in place. Why do they have it, and how do we get to the final candidate, or how do they get to the final candidate? Glenn, if you would take that, please.
Well, I think that the Supreme Leader and his apparatus have vetted those that have been selected of the 80, that they're acceptable to some degree, and then they'll all play a different role in the election. Why do they have debates? I think that they are trying to attract some kind of support from the Iranian people. All the reporting is that voter apathy is growing. People, we have a generation of Iranians who have never seen anything close to like a real election. We've seen suppression of people when they try and express their views, including the use of force repeatedly. And I'm sure that for some legitimacy, the Supreme Leader wants this election to appear both to the international community and to the Iranian people as somewhat fair and free. But I think that I don't think it's going to work. My prediction is that the turnout will remain low, the apathy will remain. And I think more important than the actual result of this election is what's happening around Iran right now. It's a very, very tense time. It's a very dangerous time. And for me, I don't have the answer. It's a question. What is the Supreme Leader looking for in the next president to message the world and the international community? Because we remain in a very tense situation, and Iran is at the center of that tense situation and has created much of that tense situation, in my opinion. So I think that what will happen afterwards, we'll see when the elections happen, who he's decided he wants, and then we can all the Iran watchers will try and analyze and determine what his message is to the international community by his selection.
Paula, how would you characterize the candidates, and that and how what would be the criteria for the supreme leader to keep in mind as he's making this election? Because it seems like it's not really an election, it's a selection process. And if you walk us through the Guardian Council's role in all this, and if there are any conflicts, crises that you see from the outside.
So the Guardian Council is not like anything we have in the United States. And it's important to, I know that many I talked to in America, and as I grew up in the both Foreign Service and CIA, there very few people are interested in talking about religion in the public square. We're not comfortable with it, in my view. I've delved into interfaith issues based on working in a variety of countries that have lots of different faith traditions. In Iran, it is a theocracy. The Guardian Council has only two jobs. It is to protect the theocracy and the supreme leader. So they pick people, the gauntlet people go through. Those 80 were narrowed down to 6 that were deemed suitable to continue the tradition of current policy. And to provide the world and the Iranian people with some semblance of a free and fair election. But the sorting factors that they use to get down to these particular 6 are already defining the left and right limits of where they will be able to go. It is impossible, therefore, for the Iranian people to have some say in change. They won't be given that opportunity. You have to go down to some pretty lower levels in the government to find people who are willing to try new things. And that's why it's so important to look at the mayor of Tehran. It's such a big city. The mayor of Mashhad, the mayor of Tabriz. Those are areas where you find opportunities to try new things. And if they are deemed successful and within the limits of the interpretation of Sharia law, then they're allowed to roll up a little bit higher in the system. But the guardians themselves are guardians. That's exactly what they are. They don't stray very far. And in the theocracy, I think it's also really important. I think later on we'll probably talk about succession planning for the supreme leader. The die is cast. Unless all of a sudden Iran decides not to be a theocracy, the guardians are going to make sure, as will the Assembly of Experts, that no one left or right of whatever they set the limits will be allowed to have a voice. Also, I would add the average, according to UN statistics from last year, the median age in Iran is 33. What Glenn said is so important. The vast majority of voters know nothing about true democracy, a functioning economy, or merit-based opportunities. So I don't expect a high voter turnout, and I don't expect much enthusiasm. And I think these are two things the supreme leader is hoping for, because those are mirrors that the electorate gets to tell him every once in a while. They get to tell him through their participation and enthusiasm level the extent to which he enjoys their support. And that's the real vote.
Yeah. And the voter turnout in the last elections have been abysmal, right? Like under 10% in some cases, which really is low. Very, very low. So let's sort of widen the scope and bring in some foreign policy, maybe even the nuclear issues into the conversation. So we have the first question coming in. How would a possible Israeli operation in Lebanon against Hezbollah impact the elections? And once please do, Glenn, maybe we could start from you to tackle that issue. And Paula, if you would think about some of the other related issues like the war in Gaza or the even nuclear issues, how do they figure into the election at all, if at all?
So to start with the question of a potential Israeli operation into southern Lebanon, obviously that operation risks a much wider or expansion of the war that's already happening. I think the Pentagon has warned that the assessment is that the Iranians will enter that war to support Hezbollah. My own assessment is it depends on what type of operation the Israelis conduct. So we shouldn't assume that it's going to be a total invasion of Lebanon. It may be a very precise operation if the Israelis launch something. I think we know the Israelis are under a lot of pressure to do something because as Americans tend to forget, 60,000 plus Israelis have been dislocated since 7 October. They cannot go back to their homes. They cannot go back to their livelihoods. It's hurting the Israeli economy. And we're coming up to, October will be a year that they have been forced out of their homes, and the government in Tel Aviv has got to do something about that. And Hezbollah, which is in violation of UN agreements on where they're supposed to be along the border, and the governor of Lebanon, which has been unable to enforce the UN mandate there, and unfortunately the UN, which has been unable to enforce that mandate, has allowed a situation to develop where Hezbollah is launching attacks against Israeli territory right across the border, and it's costing the Israelis dearly. So there is the potential that the Israelis will have to go into Lebanon at some level I should say, expand their operations beyond their current level to deal with this threat and to allow the Israelis to go back home. Whether the Iranians will get involved, I think there is definitely concern, and there's reason for concern because Hezbollah is the number one pawn in the axis of resistance that the Iranians have created. It's their number one proxy. It's their pride. And if they fear that the Israelis are going to destroy Hezbollah, I think they may get involved. And then, of course, the question will be, what is the U.S. response and what is the international community's response? I personally would hope that we would stand behind the Israelis and recognize that Hezbollah has been terrorizing not only Israel, a country which is dedicated to wiping off the face of the map, but also the Lebanese people, who, again, most Americans don't know the price that the rest of Lebanon is paying for Lebanese Hezbollah and Iran's use of Lebanese territory to harass and attack their neighbor. And so, personally, having lived in Lebanon, my heart goes out for most of the Lebanese who are suffering in these conditions, where they don't know day to day what's going to happen, and they have no control over a militia, an armed militia, which does not take its orders from the Lebanese government or the Lebanese people. It takes its orders from Tehran.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to add anything to that, Paula?
I would just add that, first of all, I agree with everything Glenn says, but I would also add the additional context that from Iran's perspective, Iran established Hezbollah. It has funded, equipped, trained, and controlled Hezbollah since the 1980s. I teach a course at Georgetown about Turkey, Russia, and Iran, and it's about modern warfare. I several teaching points in the class, but one of which is we have a hard time in our country defining war. It has lots of ramifications, I get that. But the sophistry around the word war is harmful at this point. Iran is conducting warfare against the United States, against Israel, and it is doing so in several theaters. We ought not be cute about the word war.
Ooh. That was
It's hard stuff, but I've been at this for 40 years. This is 40 years of not calling war war, calling it insurgency, calling it terrorism, calling it proxy, calling it low intensity. It is war. People are dying.
Why are we hesitating to call it a war?
Best question ever. We have to talk to the administrations and we have to talk to Congress.
I think it's also
When you
important.
call
I agree
something
with-
war, there are lots of constitutional and budget and organizational structures that have to come to the party.
I agree with Paula 100%, 110%, 120%, because she's my former boss, so I better be 120%. And she's my neighbor, and she's like a sister. But I would also say that it's not just Iran now, but never to this point, the Russians and the Iranians have not been so close. The Iranians are assisting the Russians with their terrorization of Ukraine. Many of the weapon systems being used by the Russians against the Ukrainians, against the civilian population of Ukraine, are made in Iran or based on Iranian designs with Iranian support. And as Paula said, the Iranians have waged war against the United States and our allies around the world for a long time. They see this as a war. I believe the Russians see that they're at war with the United States. I personally believe we just refuse to accept that we're at war. Maybe because the way we define war, but maybe it's a different type of war, but I say this all the time. I personally believe we are at war.
What would change if we were to call it a war?
Force posture.
Force posture.
Force posture would be the main thing that would have to change. And it's an election year, not necessarily a popular, but it is the discussion that has not yet taken place in a robust enough fashion, in my view.
And I would say, if you look at the Supreme Leader, he's probably got to think too. I mean, he probably, this is my assessment, doesn't want to push the United States right now. He's going into an election here. I think the US election is probably more important for him than the presidential election in Iran in many ways. And so what's going on in the region, I also do not believe that they want an expansion of the war with Israel, because there will be serious consequences. It's my own assessment. I could be wrong, but they may not be able to control that because of forces that they unleashed and created themselves, which is kind of ironic.
Oh, you generated so many new topics for the conversation now. Let's talk about the sort of to continue this in a way, but also bring in a new topic. Supreme Leader succession himself. He's 85 now, right? So he's looking at the next president of Iran, probably is trying to protect his legacy, and he maybe even help the process of selecting the next Supreme Leader. So Paula, what do you think are his calculations? What is he thinking in terms of who could replace him, or who would be his successor? Is it foreign policy? Is it domestic politics? Is it nuclear issues? What could be his thought process in this?
I think his main thought processes will be two. One will be to continue the regime that he has established. And number two, his legacy. So just like there are left and right limits on the Guardian's selections for presidential candidates, I think it's a very narrow group of people that will have persuaded the Supreme Leader and the Guardians that he will cultivate and maintain relations with the IRGC, which has only one job, which is to protect the regime, and to make sure that the relationships with the bonyads, or the foundations that protect the regime's wealth and help them evade sanctions, are as close to hermetically sealed as possible. And there are very few people that fit that. I talked earlier about the role of religion. The very interesting thing for people to keep in mind about Khamenei is that his religious credentials were very weak. When Khomeini picked him, the Assembly of Experts had to rewrite the Constitution because he wasn't an Ayatollah. He wasn't a grand Ayatollah. He wasn't even a Marja. many, many years after he became the supreme leader did he earn the title Marja. So don't look for a highly respected Ayatollah to be on the list. I personally think that the most, or one of the most likely candidates will be his number 2 son, Mojtaba. Mojtaba is a lot like his dad. He's not necessarily known to be religious, or he's religious, but he's not a cleric. He's an administrator. And he's loyal. He is the one who oversaw the brutal crackdowns after the fraudulent elections that brought you a second term with Ahmadinejad. And he's proud of that. It used to be he hid behind it as, no, these were free and fair elections. And then as he got credit for having pulled it all off, then of course he started bragging about it. People are also beginning to refer to him as Ayatollah, which tells me that they're paving the way for him to look like he has the religious credentials to replace Daddy.
Would that be, Glenn, would that be something that happens usually when it's, given, passed down to the family member or to the son especially? And what implications would that have if that were to be the case internally?
To my knowledge, it hasn't happened before, but it doesn't mean it cannot happen, especially in Iran today. Going back to the question of, the supreme leader, in my assessment, we have to remember that he is going to look for someone that can defend not just his legacy, but Shiism, the Shia faith. They believe they are under a constant threat. You have to look at the history of the region, of the, what's going on historically. And, I think he's looking for someone that can defend Iran and his legacy from the ideological threat from the West, from the US. I'm sure he believes that we are actively trying to undermine the faith. And of course, he's surrounded by other threats in the region that he's got to be concerned about in his mind. And so he's going to look for someone that can do it. I agree with Paula. If his son is someone that he believes can do that, and is conservative enough and strong enough and a good enough administrator to manage that, then they'll set the precedent.
Paula, you were shaking your head. Were you disagreeing or you wanted to add something?
No, I was agreeing. Khomeini hated the monarchy. He defanged it, dethroned it, he loathed it. So it'd be very interesting to me how he would think about a succession planning through heredity. Not something I don't think he could have foreseen in 1989. But, he only got to be the supreme leader for 10 years. And now Khamenei has stayed together a lot longer. So we do not know such things. But right now, when I think about who would defend and protect the supreme leader's vision and legacy, I spend more time looking at how people are reacting to Mojtaba.
Glenn, you raised a very important topic, which I'm sure our audience is also very interested in. What do you think, especially the Supreme Leader is thinking about the US elections? So imagine two different scenarios. President Biden gets reelected. What does that mean for Iran? And President Trump gets his second term. What does that mean for Iran? How do you think he's looking at these two different scenarios?
My own assessment is that he sees the current administration as being a better administration for him to deal with, that they have been more willing to make concessions, to give concessions to Iran. And of course, the Trump administration, when they were in the White House before, it was the maximum pressure campaign. And they've been very clear, and the people around him have been very clear that they are going to take a much tougher line on Iran. And so he has to consider that. I think he probably views the Trump administration as more dangerous for his interests, or for the interests of the small group of Iranians that run the country for him.
Yeah. And talking about Trump administration and then Biden administration, maybe it's worth mentioning the JCPOA. Do you think it has any future? Is it completely dead? Are elements of it are there elements of it that can be revived or be effective? Paula.
So the Iranians have begun to enrich uranium at a faster speed than negotiations can possibly stop it. In my own view, and I've spoken about this in various fora, we ought to be spending a great deal more time talking about arms control at this point, because it's all but too late. The shot clock has run out, in my view.
Okay, let's pull in some of the questions from the audience back again. So Robert Sweeney is asking, given the current boundaries to a political change that Paula emphasized, and the lack of effectiveness of sanctions and other policy, what channel exists short of U.S. kinetic war for a change there? Paula, since Robert mentioned you.
Yeah, so I think about this a lot. And so I'm going to use some words that I need to define up front. I am not proposing war. I am not proposing war at all. I am saying that we have to confront Iran. We have to be willing to do things that more successfully confront its instruments of power. I just returned from the D-Day celebrations in France, where I had an opportunity to lay wreaths around the country. And I am more convinced than ever that we have to do more to prevent broader wars. This means we have more work to do, both in the United States and with our allies, to close financial seams and loopholes. There are plenty of financial seams and loopholes that permit the Iranian regime to divert money to their nuclear program and to their proxies. We need to do more work with partners around the world, and this is a hard ask, but it is really important. You ask your friends the hardest questions. We have to proactively interdict and destroy the sources of Iranian weapons that transit Iran to Russia, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, Yemen, and Afghanistan. We can do this, and we have to do it. And the most hard thing of all is that based on all of the work I've done on, against, and with lots of foreign nuclear weapons programs, we need to have a full court press, and that means public and private diplomacy and everything that goes with it, back channels, front channels, that put Iran on notice that if they proceed with the final stages of their enrichment capabilities, we will have to take out their missiles. The missiles are the delivery systems that bring war to your shores, not just the warheads. And there's too much discussion about the actual nuclear program. It is too late. Now we need to focus on what do you do when the missiles, and we know where the missiles are, we know where the missiles spaces are, when those things make visible tell signs, when they go up on the tells, we have to have clear conversations with Iran that we cannot wait, and we will not wait. That is the hard part. That is confrontation without war.
Glenn, would you like
to? With the Nazis, we denied their ability to go get fuel and to use their airstrips. It took a while, and it's taking a long while to get there with Iran. But if we keep using sophistry, they're going to keep pushing. They're going to keep pushing. They have been rewarded for pushing. And we're not stupid. We are not unbrave. We are quite capable.
Glenn, would you like to add anything to that?
I agree with Paula. We're quite capable. As a matter of fact, as we're talking about this, in my career in the agency, I have to say, like, our Iran analysts are some of the best I've ever seen, maybe the best. We have a lot of very, very smart, talented people. Let's hope the policymakers listen to them on a lot of these issues. But I also agree with Paula. We are going to have to deter Iran. We're going to have to be willing to use force to stop them. You know, what really concerns me is if you put the combination of the Iranians taking the next step with their program and the fact that we have to admit that we failed Ukraine, the international community did, those countries that agreed to protect Ukrainian sovereignty when they gave up their nuclear weapons, and we've allowed Russia now to terrorize the Ukrainians, including with the nuclear threat. I'm sure that there are a lot of countries in the region around Iran that are thinking, okay, we're going to have a capability as well if the Americans don't do something to really show that they are willing to stop Tehran from getting their hands on a weapon like this and then terrorizing us, using the threat of a nuclear strike to get what they want from us. And that's, I mean, it's not just in the Middle East, of course, it's other parts of the world where we have to think about this. North Korea, the threat it presents to countries around it. Okay, Russia, you know, beyond Ukraine, countries that it threatens. And in the proliferation business, I think those people that do counterproliferation are going to be very busy for a long time. And I hope that we do not let the Iranians get to the next phase. I think that would be really, I don't want to say disastrous because we can manage anything, but it would be a bigger problem than we have now, which is hard to imagine. And last thing I would say is we need to keep our allies with us, and those allies that are important to us, we should be very, very careful not to isolate them or push them away, including those that know the Iranian problem very well.
So do you think that's a factor in the current policy, current or ongoing policy, as you've sort of mentioned, that we don't want to isolate Iran and therefore lose any chance of normalizing the relations if they can be normalized?
I'll answer. I think that we have tried to appease the Iranians, to give them an opening, to show that they want to be not good partners, but more engaged, willing to make change or concessions. And of course, on the issue of their nuclear program, to not pursue this program, I think even in this my own assessment, they never were. The Supreme Leader and his team never ever were not going to stop their program. I think they used the negotiations to advance their program and to get other concessions from the United States. That's my own assessment. So I think
Go ahead, Glenn.
No. Paula?
Yeah, I think the evidence is clear. You can't make this up. You can't desire that Iran hasn't advanced its nuclear program. It has. It has advanced its missile programs. It used to have short range, and now it has medium range and intermediate range. These are, you don't need to be reading classified information to watch the march towards their program, towards their capabilities. What are they going to do with them? Well, why do you have them? They're surrounded by people that hate them. This is true. But they also do a lot of things to promote the hatred of them. So if they say they need weapons to defend themselves, and they have an obligation under all forms of international law to say these are defensive systems. They got a long road to hoe to say that any of these systems are defensive, because they're not.
This is a great sort of segue to the next question that we got from the audience. This is from the former director of DIA and Cipher Brief expert, Lieutenant General Robert Ashley. He says, my question is, with each passing election, the U.S. always wonders about the opportunity for a more moderate regime that can be brought back into the broader international order, which never plays out. However, given the majority of the population is relatively young, is the regime at risk when you think about longevity of the current form of government that has been in place for several decades now? How might the turnover unfold? Easy question. Paula, let's start from you.
Revolutions are messy and people get hurt, but they come from within. And, you know, Glenn and I have been around the agency long enough to have seen and to certainly know what we did in Iran in 1953. Not proud of that, but I also understand it. I understand that when the Truman Doctrine was signed and we said that we would defend democracies, and when Mossadegh disbanded the parliament, it was a call to arms. After he had defended Iran when Stalin marched in 1946. So it's very understandable that both Truman and Eisenhower would have been concerned about making sure that governments in that part of the world and around the world colored within the lines. The 79 revolution showed that the monarchy had developed exceptionally harsh tactics against regular ordinary citizens, and we got that wrong. Plenty of Americans served in Iran and got that part of the anguish wrong. The next generation is young. It is hopeful and optimistic like all new young people. And it is very possible that something will generate from the student level, from the women. The women had much more staying power in this last protest round than any of them I've witnessed since 1979. And so, yes, the Supreme Leader has reason for concern. He can turn on a dime and say, we're not going to do elections anymore. This is all silly. But he hasn't yet. I would watch for more, for less democracy than even false democracy going forward. And that tinderbox is just something that the Iranian people are going to have to take under their control and shape their own futures. And I think there will be a lot of Americans and Europeans and Middle Easterners that will cheer them on. But they're going to have to do it themselves. That's what we've learned. You have to do it yourself.
We saw some elements of that while the women's rights protests were unfolding in the whole country. So Glenn, if you would sort of consider that to answer the question from General Ashley, do you see a potential of the protest demonstrations coming back, whether it's the women's rights or the human rights or you name it, like objection to the succession or unfair elections, whatever it can call, whatever can bring about the demonstrations? Do you see that the scenario that Paula is talking about is possible?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I mean, you have a regime that is, they're not popular and they're being propped up by force. By terrorizing their own population. And there's always the first of all, I'm sure there'll be more protests. We've seen that periodically and at some points large scale. And until now, the regime has been able to suppress those protests by using the security elements who are willing to use direct force against their own people. But at some point, there could be a snapping point. There was in 79, right? I mean, so yeah, I definitely think it could be that. But I also agree with Paula that like we need to be very careful not to be seen as interfering or pushing or trying to dictate to the Iranians how this should go. And this is something the Americans have a really hard time with in my career. We think that we have some magic ability to tell people how to do things, and it often backfires. So I think we need to be ready and supportive, but very careful on making sure that we are not seen as interfering in what's going on. Like Paula said, let the Iranian people themselves decide. And if they go through a period like this, we're going to have to make sure that we work with our allies to maintain some kind of stability in the region, to protect our allies. And when the opportunity presents itself, then be ready to engage the Iranian people. Hopefully a new regime or a new government that is truly willing to stop its sponsorship of terrorism around the world stop its support for its proxies, and work with its neighbors. As you know, Paula made a great point. Yes, there are countries in the region that do not like the Iranians because the Iranians' behavior has made them dangerous. If we find an opportunity, I say this about Russia all the time, when we have that opportunity, we should be ready to seize that opportunity. We can't squander it. We can't afford it.
Paula, is there anything you want to add to that, or can we?
No, I think that's, you know, it's something that we should always be thinking about. We've all witnessed various things where we go, wow, we didn't see that coming. You know, melting relations sometimes happen because of earthquakes or something you can't anticipate. And then all of a sudden you go, wow, why were we so mad at each other before? We need to be open to seeing those little openings and to drive right into them, but they need to be opened by the people of Iran, the people who will inherit this beautiful Persian history and literature and country that has so much potential. It has so much potential if they could just figure out how to do better governance.
I wanted to convey what General Ashley said. Very thoughtful answer and good historical context from the 50s. Thanks. So
You're so welcome.
Let's very briefly talk about something that we mentioned but did not really go into too much detail. Russia, Iran, this partnership or temporary alliance or whatever, they are called different things, but it's obvious that they've come together in ways that we had not seen before. So Glenn, where does this lead? Does the Iranian, both the supreme leader and the overall Iranian government feel empowered, encouraged, sort of supported by Russia to continue this antagonistic relations with the West and particularly with the US?
Yes, I think they do. I think they believe that the Putin regime is going to support them and is encouraging them, although I think that probably Moscow also has to be very careful not to encourage the Iranians to go too far, because they can't afford a major war between Iran and, let's say, the US or Israel right now. By the way, while we're sitting here, I'm just looking at my phone. There's an air raid alert in Kiev right now. The Russians are bombing Kiev, and of course, I'm sure some of the ordnance they're using is Iranian made. So just have to point that out to our listeners. And this happens usually 3 or 4 times a day if you have the air raid alert from just Kiev alone. That doesn't even cover the rest of the country. But I digress. Yes, I think that the Iranians feel, I don't know if they're happy to be over-reliant on the Russians. I don't think there's you know, historically they've had very tense relations or complicated relations with Moscow. But right now I think that they see they need Moscow. And there are 2 countries that feel threatened by the United States and its ideology. Mm-hmm. So they're together.
Right. And in addition to purchasing drones from Iran, Russia is also, as we know, is building a drone factory in Russia with Iranian help, of course, and technological know-how how to produce those. So it's much deeper than just the arms trade between them. Do you have any thoughts on that, Paula? Would you like to add anything on that relation?
Yeah, I think a lot about Iran and Russia. Here's just an additional layer I would add to what Glenn said, which I totally agree with. The further step back that I would take is just either to tell listeners who are unaware or to remind listeners who are aware that, you know, if you're talking about Iran and Russia, throw in Turkey. I believe that this whole area between the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean and now the Red Sea is one big geostrategic ecosystem. And when we in the United States trend towards, we'll have this policy with Russia and strategy, and we'll have this policy with Iran and strategy, and we'll have this policy with Turkey and strategy, we create seams. We create seams that we don't anticipate in terms of their Their very long, ancient, empire-based relationship has formed in their reactions to pragmatic needs. The Ottoman, the Persian, and the Russian Empire went at it for centuries. There is deep enmity. When I would meet with Turks over many, many years, and we would talk about Russia or we would talk about Iran, the most common word that would come up was enmity. That hasn't changed. We sometimes overreact, miscalculate, misread, misunderstand to the interactions between Turkey, Russia, Turkey, Iran, Iran, Russia, and we can strive to do better. We can understand that they all work pragmatically to try to get advantage at the other's expense. And that's clearly what's happening right now. There is no sudden love affair between these two countries. And in the case of Turkey, we ought to be repairing and leveraging our relationship with them as the only NATO country that shares a long border with Syria and Iran and a very long sea coast with Russia and Ukraine. This makes the antagonism between the United States and Turkey makes no sense to me at all.
Glenn, would you like to add anything to that, to Turkey and later region?
I agree with Paula. I mean, this is what I meant before. Like we need to stop isolating our allies, even if they're difficult allies. It's not just Israel that we need to be careful to isolate or push away, but Turkey. You know, it's a very, very important relationship, highly complicated, but very important. And I would also say we have a great opportunity now, in my opinion, in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We need to take advantage of it. I hope we're doing everything we can to help the Armenian Prime Minister, who in my opinion has shown incredible courage in taking some steps to try and resolve the conflict, which has been going on for a very long time. And if we can get to a settlement between Azerbaijan, between Baku and Yerevan, this is going to be a win for us, for Turkey, and it's going to be a loss for Russia and Iran, who have used their monopoly over Armenia and the situation in the South Caucasus for years to our disadvantage. So a lot of people aren't paying attention to it, but it's critically important what is transpiring now between Baku and Yerevan. And our support for both sides is important, but I personally think right now for the Armenians to send a message to Moscow and to Tehran that we are not going to let them destabilize Pashinyan government is very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
And the Prime Minister deserves a lot of credit for taking a courageous stand, in my opinion, on a very some difficult issues.
Absolutely, yes. And you know, from my last name, you may have guessed that I'm from the South Caucasus and I'm from Georgia. And Georgia is, of course, an integral part of those discussions, and at one point the closest ally of the United States. But this not having a comprehensive policy or not the South Caucasus policy from the United States is also shown in Georgia, as Russia, Iran, Turkey are each one of them are large players. So what should be the, I mean, this, I don't mean to take the conversation away from the Iranian discussion, but what should be the US's policy towards South Caucasus, to keep in mind, again, this like incredibly powerful players in the region, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Syria's right there, Afghanistan's right there. How should it look? What do you think, what the policy should look like? Paula, can I come to you?
I'm very supportive of working with NATO partners to bring Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan into NATO. Hurry up and get it done. Hurry up. You know, Russia has been occupying South Ossetia since 2008. It is unjustified, unwarranted, and they've paid no price. This is part of the reason they have gone into Crimea and then Ukraine. We did not act strong enough in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. There was a reset shortly after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, and we're still suffering. Well, I should not say suffering, but we're still seeing the consequences of that reset at that time. So we have 5 minutes left before we need to let our panelists and guests go. Do you have any closing remarks about all things related to Iran and maybe U.S. policy towards Iran? Paul, let's start from you. I'm sorry, Glenn. I apologize. Let's start.
I would just say it's not really on topic, but I just want to say, like, condolences to those people that died yesterday in Dagestan. It's not really Iran, although it is related because it is terrorism, and Iranians continue to support a state sponsor of terrorism. But what happened there should be a wake-up call or a reminder for Americans that this problem of Islamic extremism is not over. And we'll see whatever we can learn from what the investigations that the Russians do, what other information becomes available. But it's a horrible attack on synagogues and churches. And I think it talks about how dangerous the situation is in the Caucasus and in Russia itself. And I asked this question over and over again. I wrote an article about this a couple of months ago, but has Putin really brought stability to Russia? I don't think so, by his actions in Georgia, against the Georgians, or in Ukraine and against his other neighbors. And so just terrible, terrible news and heartbreaking.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Paula, any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I support a more confrontational approach with Iran, not just because of Iran, but because Russia is bent on devouring Ukraine and expanding its Syria-based navy into the Eastern Mediterranean. They are hanging around in Egypt today, and not enough people are talking about what are the Russian Navy vessels doing that are have a long-term lease in Syria. We need to keep our eye on that because the Red Sea is just a small sail away. Secondly, Russia and Iran understand and respect America's power and our ability to work in a combined arms environment. They do know that we are exceptionally good at what we do. And this is why I think it is so important for the administration, no matter who wins the election, to thoughtfully contemplate repositioning forces as far close as possible, furthest east possible. And that means you better fix your relationship with Turkey. And then finally, diplomacy and sanctions haven't done the full job. They're still super important, and they will work more effectively if our military force posture is woven more tightly into the tapestry of the whole strategy. You got to do Russia and Iran together. You just can't separate them, in my view.
Very, very insightful. Thank you so much, Glenn, Paula. Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for joining us, sending your questions. And before we close, I would like to remind everybody that we'll be hosting another webinar on the Taiwan Strait crisis. So please register, join us, send us questions. And I would also like to remind you about our upcoming Threats Conference. And you can find the link to register on our website to the conference. And you must remember that the subscribers and members have a special discount for the conference participation. So thank you very much to the panelists, to the audience, to everybody that participated in putting this technically together. And we'll see you at the next webinar.